We talked earlier about the struggle of workers, and some workers have died struggling for justice. And that's one of the reasons we're meeting here tonight, to remember those workers, because people give their lives, really, for health and safety. People give their lives to protect us, all of us. And that's why we have Workers' Memorial Day, to remember in part those workers. So our next speaker is Dr. Ahimsa Porter Sumchai. She's a doctor who has been fighting for health and safety rights for the working people of Hunters Point Bayview and for all working people. Welcome, Dr. Somchai.
My name's Ahimsa, and my dad, George Donald Porter, career longshoreman. He was a walking boss and a shipping clerk for American President Lines, and Harry Bridges might as well have been at the dinner table. You know, my dad was a card-carrying member of the ILWU, and he would come home with photos that he had taken at the shipyard. We had albums full of photos that he had taken. My son is the keeper of the archives. And I can remember when I was 5 years old, we were living in the Potrero Hill housing projects. My dad would drive up in his old Buick, license plate BYN 499. You know, 5-year-olds remember a lot. You know, and he'd just come down the walk, you know, swinging his metal lunch pail that always had a treat in it that my mother hadn't put in there that morning, wearing his steel-toed boots. And you know, he was a handsome guy with a big smile and told corny jokes, and a lot of the kids in the neighborhood didn't have dads, and I was fortunate, and many of them would join me in greeting him. I stayed with my dad for a while on Silver Avenue in a house in Bayview while I was in medical training. And in 1992, I don't want to make the story sound as if it was a fairy tale, because me and my dad, we had our differences. We actually, you know, had some major conflicts, but we had resolved a lot of our conflicts by February of 1992. In fact, on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1992, we went shopping at the local Safeway, and he bought me a box of Godiva chocolates. And on February 19th, the morning of February 19th, he didn't come up for breakfast, and I knew something was wrong, and I went downstairs, and I found him dead. He was 58 years old. He died prematurely. He was a career longshoreman, and he was forced into retirement, into a medical disability, early retirement. And I am the physician on his death certificate, and I ordered his medical record. I was at that time a physician specialist with the Department of Public Health, and I thought that I should get the medical record just to be sure of what was going on. And there was the chest x-ray, and the chest x-ray demonstrated some signs of fibrosis in his lungs that were consistent with pulmonary asbestosis. And my dad hadn't told me about it, but he had contacted lawyers with a firm called Wortnick Law Firm, one of the city's largest, and as a result of his death, as a result of that chest x-ray, a class action lawsuit ensued that was settled, and it did benefit my family, and it benefited a number of other workers. So that's a little bit about how I am here. But significantly, I also worked as a attending physician for the Persian Gulf Agent Orange Ionizing Radiation Registry at the Palo Alto Veterans Administration, and I would see the veterans come in. The Vietnam veterans were some of the most disabled of the veterans that I saw. There were a class of veterans called the Atomic Vets, the veterans that had been active in the military in the post-World War II era. And I can remember the first time I had one of the Atomic Vets come in, and you referenced what one of them told me, that he had been called aboard a ship He was on a ship in the Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific in the post-World War II era, and he was called on board a ship and without any type of protective gear was exposed to massive blasts of ionizing radiation. There were megaton atomic bombs that were dropped on ships in the Bikini Atoll, and this was part of an experiment that was deliberately conducted to see what the impacts of atomic radiation were. These ships were hauled back to the Hunters Point Shipyard, which incidentally was working with Treasure Island. It was a joint naval station, and that's important for historical reasons because there's a lot of focus right now on residual radiation at Treasure Island, and based on what we know in the historical archives, there is reason to believe that. So I remember the first time one of those atomic vets told me that story, I didn't believe it. It was just too phantasmagorical. You know, I just couldn't wrap my mind around that type of reality. And so I dismissed it. I was seeing a lot of vets, especially the Vietnam War vets with PTSD, who were often psychotic. Some of your Persian Gulf vets were also coming back with PTSD. So I just dismissed it, you know, as being something that might have been, you know, delusional or you know, a hallucination or even psychotic, although the atomic vets, for the most part, tended to be more intact than many of your other groups of veterans. And so I heard it again, and I heard it again. You know, I was in a role where I was to interview these veterans and then to determine what kind of testing and what kind of follow-up and what kind of referrals they needed for their, you know, their health needs. So I did hear repeatedly from this class of veterans called the Atomic Vets about their experience being exposed to ionizing radiation blasts in that post-World War II era. I chaired the Radiological Subcommittee of the Hunters Point Shipyard Restoration Advisory Board. I was the founding chair in 2001, and I had access to information that was being declassified, and for the first time it was entering the public domain about the extent of residual radiation at the shipyard. And again, this was in 2001, and there are some documents that have come out of the studies of radiation activities at the shipyard. One is called the Historical Radiological Assessment, and it looks at the use of radioactive materials from 1939 up until 2004. And the scope of radiological activity is enormous, and what we're seeing now is the result of unbridled development on properties on a federal Superfund site that was never safe for human habitation to begin with, but we've already discussed and talked about some of the political, some of the economic engines that have been driving the shipyard development. We're looking at a situation right now that you're reading about in the Chronicle. It's ironic that the Chronicle is on board. The Chronicle, for most of its years, has not given a great deal of focus to the impacts, the human impacts, the health and safety impacts of the shipyard development. It has acted in concert with the political powers and overlords who've been driving the shipyard development. But you're aware right now that this Navy contractor, Tetra Tech, has engaged in a collection of soil samples on radiation-contaminated irradiated regions of the base and was caught doing it by Navy computers. The Navy computers caught Tetra Tech for a simple reason. The shipyard has so much residual ionizing radiation that when these radiation control technicians, which are supposed to be intelligent, licensed individuals, turned in post-remediation soil samples, from clean soil they'd gotten someplace, the computers detected immediately that this profile didn't meet the soils at the shipyard, and the substance that triggered the computers most was radioactive potassium. The soils at the shipyard have such residual high levels of radioactive potassium K40 that when they went and got some clean soil and thought they could just substitute it and say, look, we cleaned it up, the computer said, bing, this is not the Hunters Point shipyard, So, I don't mean to laugh. It is humorous, to think that this level of stupidity was at play. But what is scary is that the Tetra Tech workers, the radiation control technicians and the project managers were working together. This was a large orchestrated effort, and you may be seeing in the headlines that Tetra Tech is denying that it engaged in fraud. This is laughable because in 2012, Tetra Tech investigated itself and published a report in 2014 that documents, after investigating itself, that 2,500 anomalous soil samples were collected and that the majority were fraud. They took action against several of the employees. One of the employees who was linked to the collection of the fraudulent samples by virtue of the chain of custody of the samples was named Ray Roberson. And Ray Roberson, who faced an enormous amount of criminal and civil liability, as well as the potential for, opening up the cleanup to, investigations that could conceivably shut down the project. Mr. Roberson very, very conveniently and very amazingly rolled over and died, at the end of the investigation. So Mr. Roberson's cause of death, I have not been able to determine. I have tried to be, very diligent about pressing the issue of this suspiciously timed death, and I think that ultimately we will get some answers. One of the radiation control technicians who worked with Mr. Roberson believes that his cause of death was due to quote unquote foul play, and that certainly makes sense to me. I do want to talk to you about another hero, though. You saw some photos. Are the photos here? Chris Carpenter. Chris Carpenter was working on Parcel A of the shipyard in 2006, and he was working for another Navy contractor, and the role of that contractor was to grade down a huge hill, and at the top of the hill is Hunters Point, where there's public housing, children playing, some schools, and other quote-unquote sensitive receptors. There were two contractors, one Gordon Ball and another Hill, that was to monitor the dust that it was being generated, and when the dust exceeded in particulates or asbestos safe concentrations, there's supposed to be a work shutdown, and there had been a number of work shutdowns. There were also failures of the monitoring system, but Christopher Carpenter was working on Parcel A one day when the dust that was being generated was visible and triggered the monitors to shut down the work. There was a work shutdown, and so most of the workers went home. They were told that, they needed to go home, and they went home. Chris Carpenter looked up the hill and noticed that, the workers are going home, but up the hill on a playground, there are kids playing, and he deduced that if it wasn't safe for workers to breathe this dust, it certainly wasn't worth wasn't, safe for these kids. And so he went up to this schoolyard. It was the schoolyard of the Muhammad University of Islam, and he notified Minister Christopher Muhammad of the work shutdowns and other dangerous conditions that were going on as part of this massive grading activity. So that got the ball rolling on a huge event that occurred between the years 2006, 2007. There were some lawsuits filed. It took several months for members of the community to find out that they were being exposed to very dangerous levels of asbestos. Chris Carpenter lost his job. His supervisor found out that he had broke this expected code of silence and warned the community about the dangers of the grading activities. And it's reported that he actually got into a physical altercation and was fired. The good news is that Chris Carpenter went on and established his own business, did very, very well, cared for his wife and his kids, bought a great big beautiful home, and was doing okay for several years until he developed some very vague cardiorespiratory symptoms, some skin symptoms, and some weakness, and he was evaluated and found to have a cancer called a peripheral T-cell lymphoma. You don't have to remember that. All you have to remember is that Chris Carpenter was African American and that there were no cases of peripheral T-cell lymphoma reported in African Americans in the United States of America, period. So this was a unique event. Peripheral T-cell lymphomas, which I researched because in 2015, attorneys from a high-powered New York law firm called Whites and Luxembourg traveled to San Francisco to talk to me and other people because they were representing Chris Carpenter. And they believed Chris Carpenter when he told them that he thought that this rare cancer was a result of these massive unprotected exposures that he had to toxic dust working as a Parcel A shipyard worker. So when I researched peripheral T-cell lymphoma, I was only able to find 6 cases of it in the world in Black people, and they were 6 people in a cluster in the Caribbean in a region where people were being exposed to toxic environmental contaminants. So by that time, Chris was facing imminent death and facing it very, very bravely. He did go on to live, for another year, but in 2016, he did die as a result of the cancer disseminating throughout his body. It was a stage 4 lymphoma at the time of his death. So I have been terribly moved by Chris's story. I was moved by Chris's story when I talked to Robin Greenwald, the attorney with Whites in Luxembourg, but I wasn't able to find Chris. The name was too common, and I checked Facebook and searched him, but I wasn't able to find him and contact him directly. But I did attend a meeting, a community meeting that was called recently, and I had an opportunity to meet his wife, Daniela, and then I, found Chris's Facebook page, and these are some photos from his Facebook page. So, the good news is that even though Chris Carpenter died as a result of his death and as a result of this mushrooming scandal that we're seeing at the shipyard, surrounding the fraudulent cleanup of the radiation-contaminated parcels, there is going to be a mass action, class action lawsuit filed, and surprise, surprise, it's going to be filed on May 1st, so you're going to hear about it. But there are a number of plaintiffs. There are people in the adjacent community who've been identified who have cancer, and clearly, Christopher is a very, very strong plaintiff in this case. So just like my dad, Christopher Carpenter is a hero. He should be memorialized. I would love to see a physical memorial, a statue erected at the shipyard in memory of Christopher Carpenter. And if I can ask you to remember his name, I met Christopher, at the time that he was being hailed as a hero after he'd lost his job and, had alerted the community. By the way, in October of 2007, the San Francisco Board of Education voted unanimously to shut down the development activities that Lennar was conducting at the shipyard. And this was really a big event that the Board of Education bucked all of the political pressures and made this vote unanimous. And in their resolution, in the opening paragraphs that I sent to Steve Zeltzer, there is a reference to Christopher Carpenter's role in, being a whistleblower who alerted the community heroically and has, in effect, died, as a result of his exposures. So please remember his name. I was going to say I met him. He was a really handsome guy. You see the photos of him. He was a really handsome guy. He's the kind of guy you kind of think of as being a hero, just minding his business, taking care of his family, going to work, and that's what happens to heroes. They just end up doing things that are extraordinary in the process of just doing their job, So again, remember his name, and if there's anything that I can impress upon you is the need for us to erect in our minds and in our spirits and to erect physical monuments in memory of these people who have taken outstanding stances, on behalf of themselves, on behalf of their families, on behalf of their communities, and ultimately on behalf of all humankind. So thank you so much.